Well lads, I'm sick of this. I'm tired of being an entertainer, being the initiator in everything that I do. I've had it with this arrangement. It's my turn to be the viewer. Damn. You live like this? It gets tiring doing the same thing all the time. You gotta switch it up to keep things interesting. Well, maybe not that much. But that's why video games are such beloved experiences, especially in the modern era. Sure, two people may play the same game, but that doesn't mean they experience it the same way. How I played Metaphor ReFantazio is entirely different than someone else's playthrough thanks to the wide variety of choices you have in regards to how to spend your free time. The way I solved a puzzle in Tears of the Kingdom is probably entirely different to someone who has a PhD in Master Hand Engineering. And this is even more true in multiplayer environments, especially ones with the boon of choice at their core. Part of what makes Mario Kart World so fun is how many possible routes you can take thanks to the game's movement options, assuming you get a 3-lap track that is. The best games are the ones that let players play how they want, choosing your party layout and demons in SMT V, picking which action to take of your limited options en route, and literally any game with an item build system letting you change how aspects of the game function. Some of the best games give players freedom. Now this isn't to imply that linearity is a bad thing. If you make a game intended to be a linear experience, the fact that it is linear is not and never will be a problem, it's how the game was crafted. However, if an aspect of a game not intended to be linear ends up being linear, that's where issues can crop up. So what the hell does all this have to do with these three words? So to start with some definitions. Playstyle, as I'm sure most are aware of, is how a player tends to play the game. Are they aggressive or passive, balanced or chaotic, high risk, high reward, or risk averse and safe? To most people, all three of these mean the exact same thing. I define a fun game as one which allows for different playstyles to function well. An easy example is one of the biggest games of all time, Minecraft. Personally, I'm not much of a builder in Minecraft. I struggle to make buildings look nice, much to the dismay of my friends. But I do quite enjoy redstone farm building and exploration, meaning that when I play with friends, I'm on machine duty, which works perfectly. Even in single player, sure, my base never looks pretty, but I always have really funky doors and tons of resources, so the way I like to play Minecraft isn't discouraged. Gamestyle, however, is how the game was designed to be played. In the case of Minecraft, the entire point of the game is creative freedom. Do what you want to do. And this game style allows for varied playstyles by its very nature. If you take a game like Skyward Sword, there aren't many ways to really change it up. It's famous, or infamous rather, for being the most linear Zelda, though this isn't a fault, especially when playing the original. Being on the Wii means motion controls aplenty, and the lack of a proper camera to look around means the linearity of the game only serves it, making it easier to deliver the experience of actually controlling Link's swordplay. So playstyle in its variety can flourish when combined with the appropriate game style. But what happens if these two concepts don't mix? Or to put it like I said earlier, if an inflexible game style is placed inside a flexible one. The easiest way to show this is with an egregious example and some backstory. My original idea for this topic was called The Problem with Only Playing Second, covering issues that can crop up when a character has close to or genuinely no way to start interactions by themselves. They have no way to be the initiator. In other words, they cannot play, or at the very least, are heavily discouraged from playing first, meaning that they usually have to wait and react to the opponent's first move in order to have their options open up. And the most extreme example of this is Wobbuffet in competitive Pokemon. Now I am specifically going to be talking about Wobbuffet in the VGC doubles format, and I'll mention why later. So for the uninitiated, what is this thing? Even within Pokemon, Wobbuffet is an oddity, as it doesn't learn a single attacking move. It learns 8 moves total as of Generation 8, and only 7 of those being considered viable in a competitive setting with Safeguard, Amnesia, Charm, Counter, Mirror Coat, Encore, and Destiny Bond. And of these 7, no one in their right mind using Wobbuffet would ever use Amnesia, a move which doubles your special defense because it's counterintuitive to Wobbuffet's game style, which can be summed up with stop hitting yourself. Wobbuffet's entire game plan revolves around waiting for the enemy to hit it so that it can hit back with either Counter or Mirror Coat, 2 moves which reflect damage back at the opponent after the Pokemon takes damage, or even just Destiny Bond, which flat out knocks out the attacker if they knock out the user as well. But an important aspect of these moves to consider is what stat they play around. Most attacks in Pokemon use either the attack or special attacking stats. Body Press uses the defense of the user to do damage. What stat do Counter and Mirror Coat use? HP. Both of these moves return double the damage that the Pokemon takes at the target. The damage they take, of course, being the amount of HP that they lost. This means Wobbuffet never wants any investment in its defenses, as it would reduce the amount of damage it takes, potentially not letting it achieve a KO. By extension, this dissuades Wobbuffet from using Charm, halving an opponent's attack, which would have the same effect as increasing its defenses. It also means Wobbuffet wouldn't want to be paired alongside an Intimidate user or even Corviknight's Mirror Armor, which would reflect other Intimidates. For the same reason, it wants the enemies at their strongest. And all this is just in the team builder before the battle. The one benefit Wobbuffet has is Shadow Tag, an ability which traps opponents on the field. But if Shadow Tag is what you're after, Gothitelle is right there. And once you're in the battle, in doubles, sure, the opponent can't switch out now, but your partner is effectively fighting a 2-on-1. The enemy can just simply never target Wobbuffet with any moves, and half of its pressure is removed. Wobbuffet could set up a safeguard to protect its team, which is nice, but afterwards it can't do anything. If you took Charm to the battle, sure, you can start spamming attack drops on the enemy, but Wobbuffet is so slow that they'll nearly always get an attack off first, and alongside that, this does mean you have no method of dealing with special attackers. Maybe you can use Encore to lock an enemy into Protect or some other move. Well, just like Charm, good luck getting that up in time unless you're in Trick Room. And on that note, why are you using Wobbuffet as a part of your Trick Room? And all this is assuming that Wobbuffet even gets to move. With Fake Out being everywhere in VGC, it can be used on Wobbuffet for some guaranteed damage which it cannot fight back against, unless you give it the Covert Cloak item, but this doesn't exist in any game that Wobbuffet is featured in. So the Fake Out would just be used on its partner to stop them from moving, creating a free turn. If the enemy has Taunt, Wobbuffet either starts struggling or remains stuck using Counter and Mirror Coat, making it completely useless. Sure, you could use Mental Herb to protect against the Taunt, but then what? Safeguard was set up, you got a Charm off, you're being taunted again next turn anyway. Because Wobbuffet can barely do anything to the enemy if they first don't attack it, it has no pressure when on the field, and all the jobs that it does can be easily filled by other Pokemon. Shadow Tag Trapper, use Gothitelle, who can also use Fake Out, Trick Room, and even Heal Pulse for support. Safeguard to block status, literally any Prankster Pokemon. Charm to lower the enemy's attack, Incineroar. Destiny Bond Cheese? Why? And this isn't about viability itself or stat totals. What makes these other Pokemon more viable is that they get choices. They have variance in their sets. The player's playstyle can shine through with the choices they made in building their team. Now in singles, Wobbuffet is actually banned in every generation it's in, where it only has Shadow Tag because of how it warps the game. Trapping abilities are extremely powerful in singles and banned because of it. And in generations where it gained telepathy and became legal again, because of Wobbuffet's ability to only ever play second, it's always at the mercy of the opponent. In doubles, it can simply be ignored, and in singles, without Shadow Tag, it's a waste of a slot, all because it can't make any progress by itself. Wobbuffet is the most extreme example of this in action. Competitive Pokemon is a very flexible and extremely in-depth game. Any one Pokemon has multiple optimal EV spreads, moveset options, and even ability choices that affect how they're played. But Wobbuffet's game style doesn't fit well into this. Now I need to note that's kind of the point. It's a gimmick Pokemon. It's literally meant to be a punching bag that hits back with your punches, and I have no problem with its existence. It's quite funny, but it's the easiest way to get this idea across, and it's a very large part of why Wobbuffet is nearly never recommended to be used in a serious setting. While I initially sold this idea as the problem with playing second, you can view it as the problem with having no progress-making tools, or more accurately, having no independent progress-making tools that set you apart. Another example within Pokemon VGC would be Mega Audino. Now, in the first place, I'm going to need you to imagine a world where no other Mega Evolutions exist, because no one in their right mind would ever choose a Mega that can't blow you up in at least 2 hits. As a support Pokemon, Mega Audino really doesn't do much. Its ability is shared with its base form Healer, which has a 30% chance at the end of each turn to cure your ally's status condition. Not only is having the same ability as the base form a terrible use of a Mega slot, except in a few cases, but Healer just isn't a very good ability in the first place, which is why Audino always uses Regenerator to heal on switch out. If you want status conditions to be cured, you probably want them to be outright prevented, and during Sun and Moon, there were plenty of methods to stop this. Safeguard to block all the status effects, Lumberry on the Pokemon you want protected, Safety Goggles to block powder-based status moves, or even Heal Bell if it's specifically status curing you desire, and in that case, Audino learns Heal Bell, so why bother using the Mega Stone for a worse ability when it normally has one of the best in Regenerator? It also needs to be mentioned that using a Mega Stone leaves Audino itself extremely vulnerable to status conditions, which it can't cure. But what does all this have to do with only playing second? It's all quite similar to Wobbuffet, but in a less extreme manner. Yes, Audino does have Dazzling Gleam, which can do some decent chip damage to opponents, but it's not nearly as threatening as something like Icy Wind from Cresselia, which yes, does do less damage, but the slight damage that it provides, and more notably, the speed lowering effect offers progress that wouldn't make a move such as Taunt a free click against Cresselia, as it still provides utility. Mega Audino is very slow, and while that would make it a valid Trick Room setter, I just talked about Taunt. And if Trick Room was what you desire during Sun and Moon, especially early on, Mimikyu was right there. Mega Audino is a Pokemon where to be most effective it would have to be in Trick Room, which only reduces its flexibility in this flexible game. You could use Icy Wind on it, but Cresselia, who I just mentioned, is at the perfect speed tier where it can work both in and out of Trick Room, which makes it far more effective for speed control, which is why it's so beloved amongst competitive players as a bulky support Pokemon, because it can actually make use of its support in multiple contexts. Mega Audino does have a decent supporting move pool, but with its low speed and item slot taken up, it can never make use of them. I've already mentioned its susceptibility to taunt users with any amount of speed, but trying to set up a safeguard even though it's a waste of a slot on this combo, your team is susceptible to status during this play. Rocking Encore? A slow Encore is good for predictions to lock your opponent into, say, a boosting move on the same turn, but a fast one is infinitely more threatening to make clicking protect or setup moves far riskier. Dual Screens? Not getting the benefit of that damage reduction until next turn. Heal Pulse is a wonderful utility, but if you're too slow, you can nearly never get it off when you really want to. While Mega Audino isn't quite as extreme as Wobbuffet is, using it always puts your opponent in the driver's seat, because it is literally too slow and often playing second as a result, alongside how it's just not geared to make the best use of setting Trick Room up, as it always ends up on the back foot, reacting to the plays that enemies make, and rarely getting to make its own to try re-establish control. And on top of all of that, the one state in which it would get to make the first move, Trick Room, as I have already mentioned numerous times, it only proves that a faster Pokemon, or even just base Audino, would be more effective, also allowing the Mega Slot to be filled, and giving Audino the chance to hold a Mental Herb so it can actually use its support moves safely. Now, a fairly critical issue with a lot of the characters I'm going to be talking about in this game style versus playstyle sense is that if the character's game style doesn't match the game's game style, they typically end up on the weaker side of things, especially in the specific cases I'm talking about where they struggle to make proactive plays. Even though while yes, the lack of proactivity is a problem in their design, it's not like fixing that alone will fix them. We could give Mega Audino Moonblast, and while its damage is certainly more threatening, it's still never going to be a top tier Mega or even a mid-tier support Pokemon because those slots are firmly filled and it just doesn't have the tools to compete. And a commonality you may have noticed, well, one I did anyway, there's not much else going on in here, is that these characters tend to be more supportive, or whatever the hell this thing is. And I would liken that back to support being the easiest role to end up falling into a hole, trapping it in this you have a job, now do it design. Essentially, it's the easiest role to fall into an inflexible game style, and nowhere is this more apparent than Yuumi in League. Now Yuumi is a discussion that's been done to death. Really, check your pulse. Told you. Let's get through this before the more gets here. Yuumi's passive empowers her next instance of damage and heals her, also healing the allies she's attached to. She also grants stacks of friendship when attached to allies when they earn kills on enemy minions or champions. Whoever has the most stacks becomes her best friend. Her W allows her to attach to an ally, making her completely untargetable and invulnerable, and if she's attacked to a best friend, she gains increased healing and shielding. They heal on auto attacks. Her Q is a damaging projectile, and her E is a shield and attack speed buff, which can affect her or her attached ally, and her ult sends out waves which slow enemies and heal allies. If she's attached to her best friend, the final wave is a bigger heal. Now this is a reworked version of Yuumi. I'm not going to go over her previous iteration in detail, but all you need to know is that her rework was made with the intention of making Yuumi detach from her ally more. In case you couldn't put it together while I went over her kit, or if the more got to you too fast, this effect was not achieved. League, like pretty much every game that features two sides going against each other, is a game of push and pull. Sometimes you'll go on the offensive, sometimes you need to react to the enemy's play. It's what makes the game so dynamic. Yeah, it is fun to have that godlike game where you're the most fed person in the lobby making every engagement and starting every fight, but it's also fun to try outmaneuver the enemy as they try to tower dive you. And Yuumi? She can never make the engagement herself. Every other support in the game has offensive and defensive options. Sure, they'll certainly lean on one more than the other. Pyke is definitely going to be diving in more than he'll be sitting back to protect his ADC, but they all have options, even enchanters do. Sona has speed boost and a stun on her ult. Lulu has polymorphs and a knockup, all tools that can be used both for engagements and disengagements. They have proactive and reactive uses. Sure, Yuumi can poke with her Q, which does have an alright slow attached to it, but that's nothing compared to a Nami bubble and her E. Yuumi ult can't even root anymore, it's just a stacking slow that takes way too long to ramp up to be useful in an engagement. Other supports get a choice in how they want to play. They could do nothing but sit back and shove steroids into their ADC, or they could decide that they are the carry now, but the important thing is that it's something the player decides. Like I've already said, Yuumi can never make the first move. She's an introvert in the talking stage. Keep this letter away from her. In an objective sense, this is untrue. Her Q and ult are slows, very useful tools for starting engagements, but out of the entire list of characters labeled as supports, she is the only member of it that does not have at least one ability that applies some form of hard crowd control. She used to have a root, but they got rid of it, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but on a support, having no hard CC heavily limits the possibility for you to start or even just help kickstart engagements for your team. Yuumi heavily struggles to assist in even simple 2v2 engagements with her own ADC, if they don't have something to stop the enemies from moving themselves, that is. This would lead you to believe, especially when looking at her passive and E, that she's meant to be the stereotypical support, hiding in the backline, kind of forced to play more reactively because you can't heal damage that hasn't been dealt yet, and her shielding really isn't the best until later on, but this wouldn't be entirely true either. Yuumi cannot position. Her positioning is whatever her allies is, and she's not encouraged to have her own, especially ever since they changed her passive to proc off any damage instead of just her autos. She is always encouraged to stay on her ally to make sure they have as many stacks as possible, and getting off of them only makes her worse, as by herself, Yuumi is nearly entirely useless. Other supports at least have the possibility to escape if you catch them out on their own if they play well, but Yuumi just dies. Forget a different game style, Yuumi is playing an entirely different game inside of League. Unlike every other support, she doesn't get a choice in how she wants to play. She has to sit on her ally, and she has to be at the mercy of their positioning, and she nearly never gets to be the spearhead of an engagement, otherwise she simply weakens herself immensely. And this is the other factor of a mismatched game style. If you try and break away with your own playstyle, you suffer for it. Take the second iteration of Rek'Sai, my personal favourite. She was clearly built to jump into the backline and try quickly take out one of the squishy enemies with a combo, but in one game I was facing an extremely fed blue Kayn. Rek'Sai is brilliant at cancelling dashes and engagements due to the nature of her W, so I swapped my playstyle that game to peel the Kayn to protect my mid and bot laners. Sitting in the back preying on the Kayn, waiting for his dive attempt only to turn his assassination attempt back on him and kill him myself before he was even able to move. Yes, my character has an offensive nature, but I turned that offense into defense. That is a good game style, one which allows for playstyles to change. If Yuumi even tries to get more aggressive by moving up herself onto a different ally and sending out a Q, she's objectively sending out a weaker version, as when attached to her best friend, who is often the ADC, the damage and slow are far stronger. Everything in her kit directs her to staying attached to her best friend, and if she tries to move outside of this role, she's the one who gets punished for it. But for a moment, I want to look at more good examples of successful game style because all this bitching has made me dead tired. And one of my personal favourite examples isn't even a proper video game, Root. Root is a board game, a damn good one at that. Yourself and up to 3 other players take a faction and try to get points, whether through building, crafting, or dismantling opponents. First to 30 wins. Now, while the base package comes with only 4 factions to pick from, the many expansions of which I will get one day, bring the total count up to 10, soon to be 13 later this year. each faction can essentially be viewed as picking a character, and while they all offer very different playstyles based off of their immediate game style, you are free to change how you play each game. Your opening hand could lead you to playing a little bit more passive and setting up buildings in order to craft some points, or you could have a handful of ambush cards, leading you to take much more aggressive moves as you have a strong built-in defense. This flexibility isn't across every faction, however. In fact, one of my favorites to play in the Lord of the Hundreds is actually quite stuck only doing one job. The Hundreds gain points through one method, completely controlling a space on the board. When crafting, they can only gain 1 point as opposed to whatever value is on that card, and this is all because their main game plan is to hoard items, as each item gives them a new action, for 8 total, far more than any other faction. All intended for them to start as many battles as possible to completely control as many spaces as possible. They can't afford to not follow this plan or they simply won't gain enough points, and while they can't deviate from their game style in the same way that Rek'Sai can, turning offense into defense isn't exactly an option for them. They're always on the offensive, but how they go about their offensive is extremely diverse, which is why I think they're a perfect example of an overall inflexible game style still allowing for playstyle. The Hundreds select a new mood each turn, though each type of item disables a mood. If you particularly enjoy having a high card economy, you may want to keep the rowdy mood available as much as you can, meaning that you need to avoid getting the gold item, potentially leaving you with less actions for a longer time. And once those cards come in, you could end up with a Favor of the Forest card, ones which have huge value later in the game, meaning you may want to swap from an all-out offense to something more similar to zone control, as the Hundreds generally don't fully focus on building, as they also need their cards for mobs to boost their overall item and point gain as they destroy enemy buildings and ruins at the start of their turn. This means that to focus on crafting the card you want, you can't go on the complete Ooga Booga offensive that the rats are generally intended for, but the destination of an offense is still what you're always after. The journey of it is just up to you, which is how it always should be. Going back to Yuumi, she can change the journey in the sense of her item choices, while the options of a full AP Yuumi and a fairly supportive one is a lot closer to switching lanes on the motorway rather than taking a different path entirely. She'll still throw out Qs for damage and slows, but even with the extra damage AP provides, she needs to be sat on an ally to access the highest possible damage, meaning even being in range to get the most out of full AP Yuumi isn't a choice she gets to make. Though in Root, the Hundreds are really an extreme when it comes to their game style. Every other faction has essentially 2 game styles in one. I mean, you haven't experienced true fear until you've seen the Riverfolk Company raise all their prices to discourage people buying from them, only to become a full-on war criminal. And this style is generally the most common when it comes to games that offer varied playstyles. You may be locked into really only being able to achieve one result, but how you achieve that result is up to you. Take Genji in Overwatch. Yes, he's meant to be the stereotypical flanker, yes, he's meant to get kills on the squishier targets, but he doesn't have to flank to achieve this. He can stay on the front line to support the dive his tanks want to do from the same angle. He can take an off angle, whether it's from the side or high ground, to help split attention, while still being in more immediate range of his team. His game style is always the same, but how he achieves it always changes. He's no Cassidy who can go on hard flanks and also take off angles to help relieve pressure from the tank, but Cass is also able to stick in his own backline like Rek'Sai can, to turn his intended offense into defense to protect his supports from divers like Genji, who in turn could put more focus on the tank as the front line is now weaker in terms of damage output. But for a moment, why not take a look at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, a character who's quite similar to the Hundreds, but not quite there. Wrecking Ball in Overwatch is a near polar opposite to some of the other characters I've mentioned so far, because he heavily leans on being proactive. It's not that Ball can't react, saying that would be utterly stupid, but let me put it in a different way. If you play fighting games, you may be familiar with the terms advantage, disadvantage, and neutral. Neutral being before an engagement starts. In Overwatch, this would be just before the fight, the poke phase. Advantage is when you are pressing the opponent, when you're making the engagement, and disadvantage is obviously the opposite, when the opponent is pressing you. Now these aren't the exact definitions, advantage and disadvantage in particular are heavily tied to platform fighters primarily, but it can change around from game to game and even character to character, but the concept holds well in all. Wrecking Ball has a great advantage state, not only because of his speed, which allows him to ignore neutral, but also because of his various engagement options. On the opposite end of things, his disadvantage is quite poor because his disengage isn't exactly the greatest unless you're a very skilled baller. Slam will stop you in place for a brief moment, not something you desire when you're trying to escape. Shields can most certainly slow down your demise, but hook and ball form, while in a vacuum are great for trying to disengage, you typically won't have the momentum needed to achieve fireball before you fall. Ball can disengage well from his own engagements as enemies are left in a daze, but if he is ever pushed on, or in my own words, if he ever needs to play second, he is significantly weaker. Ball is a character that fundamentally changes how the game is played. He forces his team to adapt how they play since the front line is now in the enemy backline. Because Ball's game style offers little room to allow the enemy to make the first move, both Ball and his team need to spend the game making proactive plays. But unlike the various reactive examples I've used up until this point, this isn't a flaw, or at least not in the same way as the others. With the exception of Wobbuffet, none of the characters I've mentioned were made with the express purpose of being bait and wait machines. They were simply created as characters, as supportive ones at that, and their reactive nature is more a byproduct of their kits rather than their intended playstyles. This is something I've touched on in a previous video in depth and already mentioned near the beginning, but I'll repeat a TLDR here. If the end result of a game mechanic or character doesn't achieve the original intention of the developer, that is the most likely method to create problems. Obviously, not in all cases, but let's take Yuumi again because really a corpse is the easiest target. She wasn't originally made with the intention of going AFK on her partner all game, but that's how she ended up playing, only made worse by her rework, where the intent was for her to gain as many stacks of friendship across her team, but putting all your eggs in one basket is actually one of the best strategies in League, especially in solo queue, meaning that giving your best friend as many stacks as possible is the meta. Essentially, if the idea isn't executed the way the devs expected, you end up with these problems where characters just have less choices. But Ball, while presenting the opposite extreme, doesn't have this problem, because he's been built from the beginning to go hard on the offensive. He has to constantly look for plays to make or he falls behind, because he has no safe plays. Now with the upcoming parry perk and his already existing shield sharing, he does have more team-oriented and protective plays to make, but it doesn't change how he achieves his core design goal of being the most aggressive tank, which means that his actual game style isn't an issue, even though he is quite locked into constantly making proactive plays. He still offers a varied playstyle thanks to his tech opening up a mountain of options depending on how skilled the pilot is. But for a moment, I want to step away from this entire proactive versus reactive discussion, but I assure you, we will come back to him.
It always does.
While I hinted at it in the Ball discussion, a certain kind of character can change the way you, or how the players in the lobby as a whole, have to interact with the match. All because their game style sits on an extreme compared to the rest of the cast. Easiest example from a game I've already spoken about would be most recent rework Aurelion Sol in League. Old Asol had stars rotating around him at all times, which dealt damage to enemies, and he could make them extend out to do more damage and rotate faster. Stars were the most important part of Asol's gameplay. You had to have perfect positioning to make sure your damage was always at its highest. His Q would shoot out projectile which would either stun at the end of its reach, or if activated again. These two things are the most important part to keep in mind. His E was just out of combat movement, and his ult was a blast that pushed enemies back. But I just want to focus on the Q and the stars. As I mentioned, his Q could be reactivated to stun enemies, but a critical issue is that it couldn't be reactivated immediately. It had to reach his inner star range before it could. This made Asol the only character in the game with a dead zone of melee range. If any character was able to get within melee range of him, he truly could not do damage to them. Yes, he had auto attacks, but he was a mage, those things weren't doing damage past the early game. This gave Asol the most unique game style in League, one which forced the Asol player to rethink everything down to how and where they move just so that they could avoid this dead zone being accessible. Yes, there were fixes. Ghost and Flash helped give Asol more immediate combat movement. Rylai's would make stars slow down enemies that they hit, but these were all stopgaps, not fixes. If the enemy has slow resistance or copious amounts of dashes, they could easily get into your dead zone and just win, even if you used your ult to push them back, making Asol the most positioning dependent character in the whole game. And this is where my original game style versus playstyle argument faltered slightly. Asol didn't really have many options for this playstyle difference. Sure, he could make some item swaps, but those weren't viable until his third or fourth items. He could take up different types of positioning, with his game style being heavily reliant on positioning in the first place. A simple swap of where he was could change so much, but no matter what, his game style didn't offer as much flexibility as someone like the previously mentioned Rek'Sai. But in this case, it's not a bad thing. Sure, he didn't get as much choice as other characters, but his gameplay was incredibly unique in League at the time, and if that iteration still existed, he would still be one of, if not the most unique character. And when you have a character that different, a character whose design is so different compared to the rest of the cast, designing around more playstyle choices within the kit wouldn't actually achieve much in giving players the choice that widens how many players enjoy the character. If Asol could somehow work as a support, no one who didn't already like Asol would play him because how he plays is so different than every other character. While I initially sold this idea as having a game style which doesn't lead to varied playstyle being a bad thing, it really isn't in the right context. And these weirdo characters, as it were, are the perfect example of it in action. I mean, there's Ball and Asol like I've already mentioned, but why not consider Faust from Guilty Gear? How many fighting game characters can manipulate enemy hurtbox size, or have their own gameplay and plan shift wildly depending on what they pull from their RNG? Whether it's a black hole forcibly changing the positions of everything on screen, or an oil spill enemies can light on fire to damage both you and themselves. These are the types of characters which change the game you're playing. You're not playing Guilty Gear, you're playing Faust. You're not playing League, you're playing Aurelion Sol. Well, you were. These are the kinds of characters that can afford to be one-trick ponies, and they're also the characters that tend to have the most OTPs playing them. You won't find any gameplay like theirs anywhere else in the game that they're in, or perhaps even the genre. Meaning these are characters that can afford for their destination to only have one journey. Or closer to 1.5 really, but let me explain. Why is it that Wobbuffet fails, but Faust or Wrecking Ball succeed? Wobbuffet is one of the most unique Pokemon when it comes to how it plays, given that it literally cannot attack. But it does hit the criteria I've mentioned for these weirdo characters. Now the obvious answer is that Wobbuffet is a gimmick, it's a joke character, it's literally stop hitting yourself personified, but aside from the obvious, what really is the difference? As always, it comes back to the game style, or rather, the flexibility within the design. This is what I was referring to the entire time with the proactive versus reactive discussion. Having a balance, or at least the intention, to heavily lean on one side of the spectrum and having the design to back it up is a borderline requirement if you're going to create a character that can really only do one job. Wobbuffet is way too extreme. Even Ball has options to play second with if he so pleases. Wobbuffet, being a gimmick, does not. Now obviously this isn't a fair comparison, Wobbuffet wasn't built to have competitive viability, so let's look at someone who was. Lifeweaver is honestly one of my favourite supports to play in Overwatch, but don't let this confuse the fact that I also think he's one of the worst design supports the game has ever seen. Lifeweaver was the catalyst that set off the initial idea for this script in my head, because he borderlines on the extreme of only playing second or only reacting. Naturally, as a support with healing, there's going to be at least some element of having to wait. You can't exactly heal a full health bar, but forget going further than that, Lifeweaver has you hauled straight to your house after only meeting you last night. While his dash has no problems in my eyes, pedal platform is where they can begin. I fuck with this ability, I really do, both for Weaver and teammates. Having a method to access or just create high ground is really cool, but no one uses it. Now, this in particular isn't on Weaver, the problem is a skill issue of other players, but whose kit does it belong to? Pedal also makes most Weaver players, particularly in the lower to mid elos, play extremely passively, behind their team, using the pedal to get an even higher position to see most of the battlefield, and while it can be used to stop enemies or even trap them in corridors, those situations are quite niche, and their consistency leaves much to be desired, giving platform far more use in disadvantage as an escape method. Life Grip has primarily defensive uses to save people, and that's fine, that's the point of the ability, but it has multiple functions, not only for saving someone by making them invulnerable for a short time, but also by repositioning them, typically to a safer location. And while this does allow for Life Grip to be used proactively to reposition an ally, so that they can get a better position before or during an engagement, its hefty cooldown of 18 seconds means you lose a significant amount of your power for trying to use the ability proactively, instead of using it for its intended reactive purpose of protection, enforcing Weaver to play second even more. And even his ultimate being primarily healing means he can rarely use it as an engagement. Due to it being static, this only emphasizes that further. He has to wait for the fight to begin to get the most value. Yes, you can certainly use it to block off corridors far more consistently than Platform can, but just like Platform, this is quite niche. Now some may think, this is Lifeweaver. He was designed to be more passive and sit back. He was meant to be a far more reactive support, but I would heavily disagree. Lifeweaver is one of the most buffed characters in Overwatch, with 33 outright buffs since his release in 2023 and only 8 nerfs. Certain adjustments he's had could count as both, so I didn't add them, but with just these, he's had a ratio of 4 buffs to 1 nerf each patch. And of those 33 buffs, 12 of them have been to his damage. Over a third of the increases to his strength that he's received have been aimed at his ability to fight. If Weaver was truly intended to sit back and play second all the time, he would not have received this many buffs to his dueling potential, the biggest part of him that can be proactive. In fact, because of all these changes alongside the addition of perks, his most optimal playstyle is honestly one of a frontliner. Lifecycle and Super Bloom give him a commanding frontline presence. It's clear that devs wanted him to be more proactive with all these buffs and this perk combo, and while he can be, the payoff isn't nearly as good as simply sitting back on a surface level, leading most players to continue playing him passively, assuming they have no other choice. Like I discussed well back at the very beginning, by having your game style focus on only playing second, or in this case, discouraging you from making proactive plays, it clashes with changes you make to try and fix it that don't actually change the function of the abilities. You end up with a mess that the vast majority of players don't know how to approach properly. Now, in saying this, Lifeweaver has had his perks changed in Season 18, so a decent chunk of what I just said isn't applicable anymore, with Life Cycle being removed and Life Weaving being put in its place, which just increases 1 instance of healing after using your dash, and a new major perk being added in Pedal Power, granting allies that stand on pedal platform 25% attack speed. Now, in a vacuum, just looking at Pedal Power, it's actually pretty good. Not only does it create some variance in how to use platform, whether it's for positioning, attack speed, or both in certain cases, but it also gives Lifeweaver far more possibilities to assist and engage and play proactively, gripping a DPS up to platform not only for a better position, but also to increase their effective damage output, gives Lifeweaver more of a reason to not play exclusively far in the backline. Now, there is one potential issue with this as well, in how attack speed applies to any form of primary fire in Overwatch, including Lifeweaver's charge time on his healing, meaning it could just be used to enhance his healing capabilities, but this isn't a bad thing. It enables a choice in my favorite buzzword of the day. However, all of that was in a vacuum. Pedal Power is a fine perk, but it's causing the removal of Life Cycle, the perk which allowed Lifeweaver to create real variance in his positioning, not to mention how his 25 extra health, which is also being removed, assisted in this as well, given his hitbox is on the larger end. Life Cycle, Cleansing Grasp, Super Bloom, and Pedal Power would have been the perfect set of 4 perks for Lifeweaver in his current state to have a game style that allows for expression, because really, what person with a brain uses life weaving? You know, fair point. But let's stray over to a different hero shooter. One where my idea of game style versus playstyle can really be put to the test. For feck's sake, lads, not again. Marvel Rivals is one of the video games of all time, and it's a game that I have been quite critical of since its release, and this section is about to be no different, so consider some warnings here. Despite the presentation and how I speak, this video is not an objective measure, it's my opinion. And I'm about to present an opinion on a game that I'm not exactly a fan of when it comes to its design. So if you enjoy Rivals, go and do that. This isn't a crotch measuring contest, though I'd win if it was. A common complaint I've seen about a lot of hero shooters, particularly Overwatch because, yeah, is that the characters feel like tools for a certain job, that players don't get to express themselves, or better put, they feel like they just lose because the enemy picked the counter. Effectively, these ideas that the characters are locked into one game style and function like rock, paper, scissors. Now, with the 2 hero shooters I play the most and am most familiar with being Paladins and Overwatch, I never understood this sentiment. In Paladins, naturally you had talents, cards, and builds to avoid this feeling, so if you ever saw someone saying that, it was most certainly a problem with them and not the game. But in Overwatch, I still didn't get it. Certainly, Junkrat was going to struggle playing against a Pharah, but if you had the skill, it wasn't as big as a problem as people made it out to be. If you like being aggressive and love Lucio, it can work out if you're good enough. But when playing Marvel Rivals, I began to think, these lads may have a point. Now, for a while, I had to consider the game's quite new, people are learning how to play it, surely some styles will persevere. And they certainly did, on one of my favourite characters to play when I was playing the game frequently, no less. Winter Soldier is honestly just a really well designed character. I've spoken about him at length, so I'll keep this section short. Alternating and rotating your abilities is really important on him, and with how they all had different functions and combo potential, you could play Bucky in a variety of ways, whether it was sticking to the front line to try and isolate and bully the tank, taking off angles to create pressure to help your team secure space, or going on flanks to take out the backline in a different manner than the main flankers would. Now all this was before they gave him 2 charges on his E and just reduced him to a gun with no need for ability management, but that's not needed for this discussion. My point in bringing this up being that despite what I am going to say, it's not an objective truth. So with warnings and context set up, to the main point. A good chunk of the Marvel Rivals cast can only achieve one thing. They can only do their main job. In other words, they have a limited game style. An easy spot to look at and see it in action is the support side of the cast, but this is an overdone discussion, and one I've also done already, so I'm going to speed through it as well. Essentially, the supports in Rivals are stuck heal-botting. They're meant to stay in the backline, they're meant to pump out their incredibly strong healing, in part because the game's damage matches its strength, and the tanks have minimal damage mitigation, meaning they require a heavy investment of resources, which could range from taking an angle to pressure the enemy a bit, or even turning around to deal with a Spider-Man jumping them. They lose out for it. By trying to do something that isn't the one thing they're intended to do, they get punished and lose the fight. Or even when it is a viable option, like with Jeff pre-rework, in the first place, his ability to flank was not healthy, with him having an effective health pool of 600 plus just by himself, but it also got reworked immediately once it started to become mainstream. Instead of allowing him to keep this playstyle that separated him from the rest of the support cast by doing something as simple as lowering the self-healing and knockback on bubbles, instead, he was reworked to fit in with the rest of the supports, sitting in the backline because having as many people in range of his beam is what he needs now. But let's take a different angle quite literally. The DPS in Rivals, despite certainly being what Netties excel at creating, are lined with flaws in their design. To take the poster child of the role himself, Spider-Man, and quite frankly the whole host of flankers, all of whom I will return to. To get right to it, Spider-Man can only flank, and only hard flank at that. Now, to an extent, this is in his nature. Off-angling as a melee character isn't really the most plausible option, so that's more than fair, but it only makes him lean harder into hard flanking. Spider-Man cannot interact with the tank unless he's going to do some hit and run disruption with uppercut, which really just annoys them at best and nothing more. His damage on them is negligible, and while he could certainly play like a Bucky and go for some isolation with his hook adjacent webs, just play Bucky at that point, who can do far better, flank decently, and also off-angle for space. This leaves Spidey with flanking, something he obviously excels at given his insane mobility, but honest to God lads, this is his one option. If your Spidey can't flank well and hit a support with a combo, he doesn't need to be there. And that's not even mentioning how certain characters like Namor or The Thing just outright disable his existence. All this said though, Spidey only being able to hard flank isn't actually the main issue with his design, it's more so how insane his mobility is, which makes him the slipperiest thing in the lobby, causing him to frustrate even if he doesn't land kills because you just can't pin him down. The hard flanking wouldn't really be an issue with how unique he is. No other character in any PvP game plays like this. He is intended, by design, by his game style, to go on mad flanks to collapse on backlines. So by my own rules, it's actually fine that he can do this. Which would be true if it weren't for the fact that 2 other characters in the game have nearly the exact same game plan, just in different fonts. Now, in all fairness to Magic, I'd actually disagree with the general perception that she can only hard flank thanks to her teleport and passive, allowing her some presence on the front line to assist her tanks. But Black Panther does not get this lenience, and this clip is all I need to show why.
No! No way! Oh, she's gonna chase me. Nope, she's not. Alright, back to it. Yoink.
While it can certainly be argued Spider-Man has some nuances in his approach, though I would disagree still, Black Panther does not. All he has is dash and dash resets, with dash really only threatening squishier support and DPS characters, even with resets because of how few he can reliably get going in one rotation. If the dash goes on cooldown, whether it's from the enemy dodging, gaining invulnerability, or Panther flat out missing, he becomes a spectator for the next 10 seconds. Why? Because his game style is so warped around his dash and resetting it to do damage. He has no other options, and this isn't even about more abstract possibilities like proactive versus reactive. This is like Wobbuffet, but if it was a character that's actually trying to be serious. I hate to bring the curse of comparison into this because I really wanted to keep the games isolated to themselves, and at best compare characters from within it. But in this case, I just have to point out why Genji works but Panther doesn't. Genji has options. Yes, his dash resets and dash itself are his strongest tools, but he doesn't rely on them. His primary fire is good damage, deflect always has its uses, and his mobility in general is more than his dash. Blade is not a well-made ult, but neither is Blast, so it works out. Genji can have different methods to achieve kills and pressure. Panther can only go for flanks on backlines because only they can get killed by quick dash spam. Genji can pressure the tank with his frontline if they need the assistance. He can take angles and poke to prepare for a collapse, and he can go on flanks to set up a pinch, and if he misses his dash, that doesn't mean it's the end of the engagement. But it's not like some of these issues are character specific. In Rivals, I find a lot of them to be caused by the game itself, but for this example, we have to go into another character with Wolverine. He's your classic tank buster for when the enemy frontline is too much to deal with. But when you look at his Feral Leap, you may think that it can be used to kidnap a member of the backline and potentially isolate them, or at least position them closer to your frontline for a potential pick, instead of just bullying the enemy tank. Well, in order to achieve that, Wolverine will need to flank, but to do that, he needs mobility, both for general speed and positioning. But in the first place, if he wishes to flank, he needs to take the long way because his dash barely counts as one. Vicious Rampage has a solid 7.5 meter length, 1.5 meters less than Bucky Dash, half of Black Panther's, and someone tell me why I would bother bringing map swinging Amagi into this comparison. The reason I bring up the dash is because it's the shortest in the game of the abilities actually considered dashes. Now to some it's just average, and to others 2 dick jokes in one video is uncreative. But why is this more so a problem with Rivals itself rather than Wolverine? It comes back to map design. In any game that features them, the maps are the most important part. They're more important than the characters. The where is more important than the who. Maps need to be crafted meticulously. Every detail has to be intentional. Why do you think Jet Updraft in Valorant allows her to reach various high grounds? It's not a coincidence. They designed the heights with character mobility in mind. There's a reason Baptiste Jump just lets him reach certain high grounds on full charge. The jump height was created with map geometry in mind. In Rivals, this isn't nearly the case. The easiest example is Luna Snow passive, which grants her some increased jump height. Yet this jump height often isn't enough to actually make it up small ledges. It will look like you should be able to make it, your toes will graze the edge, but you won't make it up. And this is because the maps and the characters are not made with one another in mind. They're built separately. But where does Wolverine come into this? When it comes to flanks, tempo is an important thing. You can't afford to be slow. You need to be in position quickly so that your team isn't waiting for you, and while Wolverine's dash does have a low cooldown, letting it be used for traversal frequently, the brief startup and pause at the end don't exactly scream mobile, and while it also can make it to certain high grounds, it cannot do so both reliably and with pace. If you have the time, you can afford to line yourself up to reach it, but if you don't, you have to take the longer route, which can be the difference between an enemy noticing you and reaching it first, or simply being on time for your team's first engagement. It also makes Wolverine far worse at trying to contest even relatively short high ground, as his approach has to be longer, it's just trigonometry. Look at Thor's approach to high ground compared to Psylocke and then compared to Wolverine. And the reason this is of particular importance on Wolverine is because he's melee. A melee character in a ranged game needs both extra mobility and extra survivability, and while Wolverine certainly leans on the survivability side, which obviously makes sense given his character and story, he's extremely prone to being kited, and not even getting a chance to interact with enemies who aren't tanks on the front line, all because he struggles to even reach positions that aren't the spearhead of the charge. All this is to say, Wolverine was not given the tools to get creative with his gameplay. He is built to bully the tank and only bully the tank, and I haven't even mentioned the fact that the majority of his damage is percentage HP based, so he can't even be more effective against squishier characters. If you try to flank, you just don't match the power of characters who are built to do that and are only a detriment. The majority of the cast in Rivals don't get variety in their game style. Their designs force them into their jobs, and if they try to work in a different character's job, they quickly learn that 80-hour weeks are not healthy. Or they just get shot. And before I close this off, I want to add something. You can't just give a character the tools to allow for different possible gameplay after making them. In certain cases you definitely can, but not always. A favourite example of mine here would be Mauga, particularly when he was at the peak of his strength when he released. Characters have power budgets in their core design, allocated to different places. For most characters, a big chunk of that budget may be in their ultimates. For others, say Tracer, it's in their basic abilities. This means they're typically already at 100% of their power. You can certainly add more power to them in general. Simple number tweaking balance changes don't greatly add or take away from a power budget, they generally just shift the power around for whatever's needed. But for characters struggling with a lack of playstyle, simply adding something to help isn't a sound idea. Returning to Mauga, while most would be aware if they were around for it, his release gameplay would primarily consist of just shooting the tank in a war of attrition. If he outlasted them, he won, and if he didn't, he lost. He couldn't take any other options. Despite being ranged, his falloff was quite harsh to compensate for his high damage, so he couldn't poke that well. He had nothing to really provide to his team in terms of protection. Sure, Cardiac Overdrive could reduce their damage taken, but only for a very short time in a relatively close range radius, and that's gone by this point. He was effectively a brawl tank that couldn't help his team outside or sometimes even inside of a brawl. I mean, looking at other offerings, Ram had his two forms, with his regular one having a shield to help his team if needed, alongside Vortex to protect them if more mobile characters were diving if need be. Ryan has Fire Strike for a little bit of range pressure, alongside the obvious teammate in Shield. You may think Queen's Shout is actually similar in function to Cardiac's old effect, but not only is bonus health better to potentially save a teammate if you're on your own, it has the much more important effect of giving your team move speed in a bigger radius as well, giving it more potential for use before and during a fight. I'm not going to go over every tank, but basically Mauga ends up in a similar situation to Roadhog, whereby he doesn't provide much in terms of protection to the team, which resulted in him leaning into being a hard brawl tank even more. A suggestion I heard once when discussing why Mauga's design wasn't healthy with someone was that if they wanted to give him more playstyle options, such as poke, then they should just do that and add it. Just like that, just some increase to his damage at range, and now he can be useful before a fight with some poke pressure. Ignoring how his range is low as a way to give him high damage, this also messes with his power budget way too much. Say it wasn't even a fall-off tweak, but an outright new ability that just gives him ranged pressure. Trying to fit that into his kit's power budget is just not plausible. You can't just add something for the sake of adding it, it needs to be planned. When Hawk was given Trap, his damage was lowered thanks to the damage it provided. When Pigpen got removed, his damage in Hook and Gun went back up to compensate, but this was a full-on rework, maybe closer to a mini rework to some, but a massive change in his kit meant his power budget had to be fully reallocated. Mauga, gaining the ability to pressure enemies at larger ranges and be threatening with it, would take out of his brawling elements in a way that doesn't fix the problems that the previous rigid game style of only being able to brawl created. These game style problems are ones that generally, and I need to stress that, generally can't be fixed with simple balance patch number changes. They have to be tackled at the core design. Trying to give a character multiple options without making them feel like they can do too much can certainly be a challenge, but making a character that only has one job to do is an even bigger challenge on an even thinner tightrope. And even if you do succeed on that tightrope, like with Aurelion Sol, one small mechanic that creates a glaring weakness could end up with the character being completely thrown out and reworked into something generic. Which, sure, fits in with the rest of the cast and changes up the playstyle potential, but that original game style is now lost forever. You know, maybe I should change how I entertain instead of becoming the viewer. Maybe I should start a podcast. You people live like this?